The ink was still wet on the divorce papers when he packed his life into 3 battered suitcases and walked toward the palace gates, certain he was finally free. Then the gates refused to open. Guards blocked the carriage. The ring he'd already discarded was pressed back into his hands. Behind the throne, the chancellor who had engineered this divorce from the shadows watched his careful plan begin to crack. The king who had all but signed his husband away hours earlier now refused to let him leave at all. So, what really happened behind that closed door, and why did an alpha king change his mind about the one person he swore he wanted gone? Get comfortable, because we're about to tell you about the husband who tried to walk straight out on a king and the king who refused to let the door close behind him. If you've ever packed your bags to leave someone, only to have them show up before you made it out the door, tell us about it in the comments below. Your Majesty, should I leave the wedding ring on the nightstand? Or would you like me to sign a receipt for that too? The words were out of my mouth before I'd finished thinking them, and the royal bedroom went so quiet I could hear the fire snapping in the hearth. Alpha King Damian Ravensworth stood 6 feet away in a black military coat trimmed with silver, his face carved out of winter itself. Beside him, the royal solicitor clutched a folder to his chest like it might shield him from whatever was about to happen. On the writing table between us sat the single document that was supposed to end me, a petition for divorce. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be handed the worst day of someone else's life and discover it's actually the best day of yours, stick around. Because I'm about to show you, as an Omega royal consort, the law technically required me to remain under the crown's protection until the divorce was finalized. That was the polite phrase for it. In practice, it usually meant a gilded leash. 3 minutes earlier, I had opened my eyes under a silk canopy and realized I was no longer an exhausted corporate accountant from Chicago who'd fallen asleep at 2 a.m. reading the last chapter of a trashy transmigration novel. I was Kieran Ashford, unwanted Omega husband to the Alpha King, and a minor, forgettable villain in the very book I'd just finished. Same name, dramatically worse circumstances. In the story, this version of Kieran had fought the divorce tooth and nail, caused a very public scandal, and spent the next dozen chapters begging Damian to love him after his inevitable disgrace. Chancellor Edmund Castellan had quietly slid his own biddable nephew into the empty consort's seat beside the throne. It had not ended well for anyone with a conscience. I had exactly zero interest in reliving that plotline. Damian's steel blue eyes narrowed at me. You understand what this document means? Perfectly. I picked up the pen. It means separate residences, no claim on the crown, and freedom from ever again attending a 6-hour banquet where everyone politely pretends the soup is warm. The solicitor made a small choking noise. Damian did not laugh. He watched, unmoving, as I read every clause, corrected an error in the property schedule. Someone had listed a townhouse I apparently didn't own and signed my name with more flourish than the moment probably deserved. The instant the ink dried, something in my chest unclenched. In the novel, this bedroom was a cage with excellent lighting. To me, it was a hotel suite I was finally checking out of. I'll be gone by noon, I said. Something shifted in Damian's expression, not quite alarm, but its distant cousin. There's no need for theatrics. I agree completely. I crossed to the wardrobe and pulled out the first suitcase I found. That's why I'm packing quietly. 10 minutes later, 3 open bags covered the bed. I took plain shirts, 2 pairs of worn boots, a battered notebook I recognized from the original Kieran's memories, and the blue wool coat that was listed explicitly as my personal property. Every crown jewel and ceremonial gift stayed exactly where it was. Damian stood near the fireplace, watching me the way you'd watch a houseplant that had suddenly started reciting poetry. Maybe I had turned into something unrecognizable to him. Good. The sapphire choker was a gift for our 3rd anniversary, he said, nodding at a velvet box. I glanced at it. You didn't attend our 3rd anniversary. His jaw tightened. It's still yours to keep. No, it belongs to the palace. I closed the lid and set it beside the ring. I'm not walking out of here with anything that could later be used to call me greedy. For the first time, real uncertainty crossed his face. The old Kieran would have cried. He would have asked what he'd done wrong. I already knew the answer. He'd married a man who never once chose to trust him. That, on its own, was mistake enough for a lifetime. A servant appeared to announce the carriage could be ready within the hour. Make it 30 minutes, I said cheerfully. I travel light. Damian finally stepped forward. You planned this. I glanced at the still unsigned half of the agreement, the half that had been sitting on his side of the table for weeks before he ever brought it to me. No, Your Majesty, you planned it. I'm simply cooperating. I fastened the last suitcase and smiled, because somewhere beyond those palace gates waited a life the original Kieran had never once been allowed to choose for himself. A guard later told me that Damien remained standing at that table long after I'd walked away, staring at the ring, one hand hovering over the unsigned page as if it had grown too heavy to lift. I didn't hear about that detail until much later, long after it stopped being the kind of thing that could have changed anything. At the time, all I knew was the sound of my own boots on marble, and the strange, light-headed relief of walking toward a door instead of away from one. The same guard mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the king had ordered no one to disturb him for the better part of an hour, that he'd simply stood there in the emptied room, coat still buttoned, as though leaving felt like the kind of decision that deserved witnesses even when there weren't any left to watch it happen. I didn't think about that story again for weeks. When I finally did, it wasn't with satisfaction. It was with the uncomfortable realization that grief and guilt can look identical from far enough away, and that I had spent my very first hour in this life mistaking one for the other. The palace gates shut behind me with a sound that felt less like an ending and more like a lock finally springing open. I rode alone in the carriage, watching the pale stone towers shrink through the rear window while 3 suitcases rattled against my feet. The original Kieran had spent nearly 4 years inside those walls, waiting for Damien to look at him with anything other than suspicion. I had lasted less than a single morning, and I already knew I'd rather sleep in a barn than go back as a decorative husband in a very expensive cage. My destination was Thorn Hollow, a neglected country estate listed among my personal holdings, roughly 90 miles north of the capital, and, according to the paperwork, producing no income whatsoever. That sounded like paradise. No court dinners, no whispered insults behind fans, no Alpha King studying my happiness like it was evidence in a trial. The road turned rough after sundown. The oldest of my 3 suitcases felt strangely familiar under my palm, the way a favorite chair feels familiar even in the dark, as if the original Kieran had carried it everywhere. When the carriage lurched over a deep rut, it slid off the seat and landed with a thud that was wrong, too heavy in the wrong places. A dull rattle came from somewhere inside the frame, not the contents. I asked the driver to stop at the next roadside inn, carried the case up to my room, and locked the door. The lining had been hand-stitched, one corner just slightly uneven, the kind of detail no palace tailor would ever leave behind. I borrowed a small paring knife from the innkeeper and carefully worked the seam loose. A slim black notebook slid free into my palm. The first pages were columns, delivery dates, warehouse locations, and disbursements tied to the Virulin Winter Relief Fund. I'd spent 6 years in corporate accounting back in Chicago before any of this happened to me, and numbers have patterns. Dishonest numbers have even cleaner ones, if you know where to look. The ledger tracked purchases of food, medicine, and heating fuel meant for northern villages, but the delivery confirmations repeated the exact same signature, over and over, and several warehouse totals matched down to the last copper across towns more than 50 miles apart. That wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. That was fraud with a very lazy forger behind it. Tucked into the back cover was a folded letter in the original Kieran's careful handwriting. Your Majesty, it began. I know I've been told I meddle in matters beyond my station, but people will suffer if these accounts go unexamined. The northern warehouses are empty. Someone is using my seal to authorize transfers I never approved. Please believe me once, even if you never believe anything else I say. The letter had never been sent. A faint brown stain marked one corner, and I genuinely couldn't tell if it was rain or something sadder. For the first time since waking up in this body, I stopped thinking of the original Kieran as a foolish side character who'd earned his own downfall. He'd noticed something was rotten, tried to raise the alarm, and been quietly, deliberately silenced. I turned to the final page and found a list of 7 names. 6 belonged to shipping firms and treasury clerks I didn't recognize. The 7th, I did. Chancellor Edmund Castellan, Damien's closest advisor, the man who had personally recommended the divorce and supplied every accusation ever leveled against me in the original story. Below the name, in hurried, uneven ink, Kieran had written one last line: "Do not trust the man who speaks for the king before the king has chosen to speak for himself." There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from grieving a stranger who happens to share your face. I hadn't expected that part. I'd expected the palace intrigue, the arranged marriage, maybe even the villain's redemption arc if I was very lucky, and the author had been feeling generous that week. I had not expected to lie awake in a roadside inn, turning an unsent letter over in my hands, and feel something crack open in my chest for a man I had never technically met, a man who was, in some unbearably literal sense, also me, and also not me at all. I thought about the apartment I'd left behind in Chicago, the unwashed mug still sitting in my sink, the half-finished spreadsheet I'd never submit. Nobody there would ever know what happened to me. As far as that world was concerned, I'd simply fallen asleep reading and never woken up. It should have terrified me more than it did. Instead, somewhere around 3 in the morning, staring at Kieran's careful, hopeful handwriting, I made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like something settling permanently into place, whatever this life turned out to be. I was going to make sure it stood for something better than 4 years of being quietly disbelieved. I didn't sleep much after that. By the time the innkeeper's rooster started up outside my window, I'd already reread the ledger twice, memorized the 7 names on that final page, and started drafting, in the margins of my own travel notebook, a list of everything I'd need to do once I reached Thornhollow. Buy food, find shelter for whoever needed it, figure out who was stealing, and from whom and why nobody in the capital had bothered to ask. It wasn't a plan exactly. It was closer to a promise, made to a man who could no longer hear it, but who I was fairly sure would have appreciated someone finally keeping it on his behalf. Thornhollow did not look like freedom the first time I laid eyes on it. It looked like a place the kingdom had forgotten on purpose. The estate sat under a slate-gray sky at the end of a muddy lane, its stone walls streaked with years of rain, its iron gate hanging crooked from a single hinge. Half the windows had been boarded over, the garden had gone entirely to weeds, and the roof sagged over the east wing like the house itself had simply given up standing up straight. The driver looked at me with open pity. I thanked him, hauled my 3 suitcases inside, and told myself that ruined walls still beat a beautiful cage any day of the week. Then I heard a child coughing somewhere behind the main house. I followed the sound past an empty kitchen and across a yard buried in dead leaves. The old carriage barn had been converted into a shelter. Nearly 30 people huddled inside under patched blankets, mostly Omegas, a few elderly Betas, and children in coats far too thin for a northern winter. A young man stepped between me and the others like he was bracing for a fight. He couldn't have been more than 17, pale hair, tired eyes, and the careful posture of someone who'd learned to apologize for taking up space. His name was Theo Marsh. He'd grown up near Thornhollow with a younger sister, then worked in the palace supply laundry, counting relief blankets before shipment right up until he got fired for asking why wagons listed as full left the capital nearly empty. He assumed I'd come to evict everyone. When I told him Thornhollow belonged to me and no one was being thrown out into the snow, the disbelief on his face hurt worse than any suspicion could have. The estate manager had vanished months earlier. The pantry held 6 jars of preserves, 1 sack of flour, and maybe 3 days' worth of dried beans. According to the official ledgers, Thornhollow had received 12 wagon loads of winter relief supplies that season. According to reality, it had received nothing at all. I opened the black notebook that night and matched the listed deliveries against Theo's memory. The dates lined up exactly with days when empty wagons had rolled past the village without stopping once. The original Kieran had been right about all of it. Someone had been stealing from people with no power to complain, then using his seal to cover it up. I couldn't fix the whole kingdom overnight. But I could keep Thornhollow warm. The only thing of real value I'd brought with me was a silver pocket watch from my old palace life, legally mine, and stamped with the royal maker's mark, which made it worth considerably more than the metal alone. I sold it in the nearest town the next morning. By sunset, 2 wagons rolled back in loaded with flour, potatoes, blankets, lamp oil, medicine, and enough firewood to last several weeks. I inventoried the kitchen, assigned work by skill instead of rank, and turned the west parlor into a heated room for the youngest children. Theo turned out to have a real gift with numbers, so I taught him to log every item that came in and every meal that went out. Within 4 days, smoke rose steadily from Thornhollow's chimneys. Within a week, there was laughter in the halls again. A little girl named Ivy drew a crooked paper crown one afternoon and set it on my head at supper. For one ridiculous minute, I sat at the head of a scarred wooden table while 30 people called me King Kieran and passed around bowls of stew, and I laughed until my eyes watered. The next morning I woke before dawn to the sound of someone sweeping the front hall, and found an elderly beta woman named Mrs. Pratchett already at work with a broom half her height, muttering that a house couldn't heal if it stayed filthy. I didn't argue. Within a week, she'd appointed herself housekeeper of an estate that technically had no staff, no budget, and no authority to hire her, and somehow that made her better at the job than anyone the Crown had ever paid. Theo took me into the village 3 days after I arrived, mostly to make sure the jeweler didn't cheat me on the watch. And partly, I suspected, to see for himself whether I'd vanish the moment I was out of Thornhollow's sight. The market square was smaller than I'd expected, a handful of stalls, half of them empty, the other half selling less than they should have for a town this close to farmland. A baker recognized Theo and slipped an extra loaf into our basket without charging for it, muttering something about the laundry boy who finally got somewhere decent. Theo went red to the ears and pretended not to hear. "They all know you got fired for asking questions," I said, once we were out of earshot. "They all know I got fired for being right," he corrected, with more bitterness than I'd heard from him before. "Nobody did anything about it. That's the part that stings. Being right doesn't matter if you're the wrong kind of person to be right in front of—" I thought about the original Kieran's unsent letters, sitting exactly as carefully written and exactly as ignored. "I know the feeling," I said. "We're going to make it matter this time." He didn't quite believe me. I could see it in the careful, polite way he nodded, the same way he'd once looked at me across a barn full of frightened people who assumed I'd come to throw them out. But he kept walking beside me anyway, and by the time we reached the jeweler's shop, he'd started pointing out which stalls used to sell twice as much before the relief shortages began, rattling off names and dates from memory the way I rattled off numbers. It was, I realized, the first time either of us had trusted the other with something that wasn't strictly necessary just to survive the week. Theo's younger sister, Nell, turned out to be 9 years old, fiercely protective of her brother, and convinced that I was secretly a wizard because I could make numbers behave. I told her accounting was mostly just very patient arithmetic with good posture. She didn't believe me, and began following me around with a slate, copying whatever I wrote so she could practice her own figures. By the end of the second week, she could add a column of grocery costs faster than I could. In the evenings, once the youngest children were asleep, the adults gathered in the kitchen and told stories about the villages they'd come from, the work they'd lost, the small cruelties that had pushed them out onto the road with nothing but what they could carry. I listened more than I spoke. Every story confirmed what the black notebook had already told me in numbers. The theft wasn't an accident, and it hadn't been isolated to one warehouse or one bad season. It had a shape, a hand behind it. I started keeping my own second ledger, separate from Theo's, cross-referencing names and dates against what people at Thornhollow remembered living through. It was slower work than the numbers alone, but numbers don't cry when they describe an empty pantry in the middle of January. And I needed to remember that real people were on the other end of every falsified delivery record. That night I stood outside under a sky full of stars and realized I hadn't thought about Damien once all day. Then Theo came sprinting from the gate, pale and out of breath. Royal riders had been spotted less than a mile off. Riding at the front of them, carrying an arrest warrant with my name on it, was the Alpha King himself. "Before you arrest me, Your Majesty," I called out into the dark, "please ask your soldiers to lower their voices. These children only just learned that doors don't always open to bad news." Damien reined in beneath Thornhollow's crooked gate, one gloved hand resting near a sealed order tucked inside his coat. Behind him stood a dozen royal riders, their dark uniforms sharp against the snow-dusted road. I'd expected fury when he arrived. What I hadn't expected was the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes when he looked past me and saw Theo standing on the front steps, holding Ivy's hand. "You've been reported for embezzling crown funds," he said, calm enough that everyone in the yard heard it anyway. 3,000 gold crowns transferred under your authority 2 days after you left the palace. Someone has remarkable confidence in my criminal ambitions, I said, stepping aside from the doorway. If they think I've been laundering money while also personally negotiating the price of potatoes, you're welcome to search anything you like. He studied me like he expected another performance, then walked in without ordering anyone restrained. I led him past blankets drying by the fire and into the dining room we'd turned into an office. Theo set our account books on the table with hands that were shaking, but his voice held. Every purchase was recorded next to a receipt. The money had come from the sale of my watch, and the town jeweler's signed statement was clipped to the first page. We've spent less than 180 crowns, I explained. Mostly on food, medicine, lamp oil, and repairs. If I'd stolen 3,000, I've shown remarkably little imagination with it. Damien ignored the joke and read every entry line by line. His expression changed the moment he reached the official winter relief inventory. 12 wagons were delivered here. No, Theo said, before fear could stop him, his voice unsteady but his spine straight. 12 empty wagons passed the North Road. None of them turned in. One of the officers glanced toward the barn, clearly expecting hidden crates. I handed over every key. They searched every pantry, cellar, bedroom, and shed. They found dated flour, counted medicine, and measured firewood and no royal supplies whatsoever, because none had ever arrived. Mrs. Pratchett trailed the search party the entire time, arms crossed, offering a running commentary on their manners. "You'll want to mind that cellar step. It's rotted through," she told one officer, who nearly went down it anyway. "And no, that jar is preserves, not evidence, unless His Majesty intends to prosecute a plum." Even Damien's expression twitched at that one, though he covered it quickly. By the time the officers finished, their ledgers matched Theo's exactly, down to the last copper, and the search had produced nothing more damning than a very opinionated housekeeper and a room full of children who'd stopped being afraid of soldiers about halfway through the afternoon. Damien followed me into the west parlor, where 6 children sat reading by the fire. Ivy looked up and waved. "King Kieran," she called, delighted. The room went painfully quiet. "It's an honorary title, Your Majesty," I said. "The crown is paper, and the duties mostly involve tasting soup." Ivy trotted over and pressed the crooked paper crown into my hands. Damien looked at it, then at the patched sleeve of my shirt, and I could practically watch him comparing this scene to Edmund Castellan's version of me greedy, wasteful, manipulative. Nothing in that room supported a word of it. Gideon Wren, the royal archivist who'd ridden with Damien, stepped in carrying a leather document case. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "there's another matter." He set 3 sealed envelopes on the table. Each one bore Damien's name in the original Kieran's careful handwriting, and none had ever been opened. "Before we left the capital," Gideon continued, "His Majesty ordered me to review the transfer records used to justify this arrest. These were found in a restricted cabinet in the Chancellor's office. All 3 are addressed to the King. None were ever delivered." Damien's fingers hovered over the nearest one, unwilling to touch it. "When were these written?" "The first 8 months ago." The fire cracked softly. Damien looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, there was no suspicion in his face at all, only the slow, sinking understanding that the truth had been sitting inside his own palace the entire time, and he'd chosen to believe someone else instead. "You tried to warn me," he said quietly. I glanced at the unopened letters. He did. Damien's eyes sharpened at the word he, but before he could ask about it, Gideon turned over the last envelope. Written across the back, in a different hand entirely, was a single instruction: deliver nothing from Kieran Ashford to the King without Chancellor Castellan's approval. Damien opened the first letter like a man handling evidence against himself. His eyes moved slowly down the page, and with every line, the quiet in Thorn Hollow's dining room grew heavier. His jaw tightened when he reached the paragraph describing empty warehouses and falsified delivery schedules. He opened the second, then the third. None of them were accusations born of jealousy. None of them begged him to save the marriage. They were organized, precise, and painfully respectful, as if the original Kieran had believed good manners might succeed where desperation had already failed. "Why did you stop trying?" Damien asked at last. I looked toward the window, where snow had started falling in thick, heavy sheets. "Maybe because being ignored hurts less once you stop expecting anyone to listen." He lowered the letter. The words landed harder than I'd meant them to, but I didn't take them back. By afternoon, the storm had buried the road under nearly a foot of snow. Damien's riders stabled their horses in the old barn, and Thorn Hollow suddenly had a dozen extra mouths to feed. Instead of demanding special treatment, Damien carried firewood in himself. Ivy corrected his stacking technique twice, and Theo quietly rebuilt the pile the moment he left the room. Mrs. Pratchett put the Alpha King to work, peeling potatoes without a shred of ceremony. And he did it, badly. While a circle of children watched his knife work with the solemn concentration of surgeons observing a difficult operation, Nell informed him he was worse at this than Theo, which was apparently the highest possible insult in her vocabulary. Damien only asked, quite seriously, whether she'd be willing to teach him properly, and spent the next 20 minutes being corrected by a 9-year-old with visible patience. I hadn't seen from him even once inside the palace. I watched from the doorway longer than I meant to. It was such a small thing, a king with a peeling knife, flower on his sleeve, laughing at himself instead of demanding the room laugh with him, and it unsettled me more than any grand gesture could have, because it didn't look like performance. It looked like a man discovering, slowly, what it felt like to be useful to people who wanted nothing from his crown at all. By evening, the household slept and Damien and I sat across from each other at the scarred dining table. The letters, the black notebook, and a map of the northern supply routes spread between us. "Come back to the palace with me," he said. "No." He blinked clearly, unused to hearing that word from me without fear attached to it. "Thornhollow isn't secure. Then make it secure. You're still legally mine until the petition is finalized. That's not the protection you think it is." His jaw tightened. But he didn't argue the point. I set one finger on the map. "I'll help investigate the missing relief funds. I know how to trace false accounts. And Kieran left enough here to start. But I return only as an independent advisor. I choose my own room, control my own schedule, and leave whenever I decide to. Thornhollow stays protected, and no one here gets displaced. You're giving orders to your king. I'm stating the price of my cooperation." For a long moment, only the wind answered. Then Damien nodded once. "Agreed." It should have felt like a victory. Instead, in the firelight, he looked like a tired man discovering that the people closest to him had spent years quietly building walls around the truth and calling it protection. "Can I ask you something?" he said, after a while, when the fire had burned low enough that neither of us bothered feeding it. "You can ask. I make no promises about the answer. When you woke up here in this life, in this room, were you afraid?" I considered lying, just to keep things simple. "For about an hour. Then I found the divorce papers on the table and realized fear was going to be a very inefficient use of my morning." That got something close to a real laugh out of him, low and startled, like it had escaped before he'd decided whether to allow it. "Efficient," he repeated. "That's an unusual word for a man who just discovered he'd been transplanted into someone else's marriage. I told you, I was an accountant. We're very fond of efficient." And now, I looked around the dining room, the drying blankets, the sleeping household on the other side of the wall, the black notebook that had, in less than a week, upended everything either of us thought we knew. Now, I think efficiency was never really the point. It was just the only language I had left, until I found a better one. Damien didn't ask what the better language was. I suspect he already knew, watching me talk about 30 strangers, like they were the most urgent, most important account I'd ever balanced. He simply nodded, once, and let the silence hold the rest of it for both of us. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters Theo had nailed shut that morning, and somewhere down the hall, a child murmured in their sleep before settling. It struck me, sitting there in the low firelight with a king who had finally stopped performing certainty he didn't feel, that this, the tired quiet of a house full of people who trusted the walls around them to hold, was the closest thing to a throne room I'd ever actually wanted. The next morning, Gideon returned from the village archive with a bundle of old correspondence copies of letters Kieran had sent through unofficial channels, ones that had never made it into any official file. Damien read every one. He learned that Kieran had requested medicine for northern clinics, questioned warehouse totals, and asked for an investigation months before the shortages ever became public knowledge. He also learned things that had nothing to do with fraud at all. That Kieran remembered his coffee without cinnamon, that he knew which council meetings triggered his headaches, that he'd arranged his late mother's favorite song to be played on the anniversary of her death, then listened from another room, because Damien had never once invited him to stay. "I remember that music," Damien said softly. "I thought Edmund arranged it." I closed the file. "You thought Edmund arranged everything." His eyes met mine, and this time he didn't look away first. Later, while Gideon and Theo compared shipping records in the next room, Damien found me alone in the library. "I didn't know you," he said. "No," I agreed. "You knew what other people said about me." He reached toward a folded page tucked in the last archive file, then stopped himself. "May I?" The question surprised me more than any order could have. I nodded. He unfolded it and read the single sentence written in Kieran's careful hand. "I do not need him to love me. I only need him to believe me once. Damien read it 3 times before setting it down. I should have believed him, he said. The distinction in his own words made my chest go tight. Him, not you. For days, he'd been listening to me talk about the original Kieran as though I were describing a stranger whose memories I'd simply inherited. Rather than a life I was actually living now, I could have kept pretending. But we were sitting in the middle of stolen ledgers and unopened letters because of secrets. And I was suddenly deeply tired of adding one more to the pile. The man who wrote that sentence isn't exactly the man sitting across from you, I said. Damien went very still. Explain. I looked at the fire instead of his face. The morning you brought me those divorce papers, I remembered this whole life, but it felt like reading someone else's diary. I knew his fear, his loneliness, every room he waited in for you. But I also remembered another life, in another place entirely. A small apartment, a desk job, no royal title, no palace, no you. Then I opened my eyes here. You believe you became someone else, he said, carefully, like he was testing the shape of the words before trusting them. I believe Kieran reached the end of what he could carry, and somehow I ended up picking it up where he set it down. For a moment I braced myself the way you brace for a door, slamming some old instinct left over from a life spent flinching before disappointment could arrive on schedule. I thought of the version of this conversation the original Kieran must have imagined 100 times and never once dared to have Damien's face going cold. A summons for the palace physicians, the quiet, humiliating certainty of being disbelieved yet again in a life already built entirely out of not being believed. He could have called for physicians. He could have accused me of lying to manipulate him. Instead, he just studied me in uneasy silence for a long moment. I don't understand how that's possible, he said finally. But the man in front of me doesn't move, or speak, or look at this palace the way he used to. I won't call you a liar simply because the truth frightens me. He asked what I remembered, whether I'd meant harm to the kingdom, whether I still intended any. Absolutely not, I said. I've only just gotten the pantry fully stocked. A faint laugh escaped him, the first real one I'd heard since arriving. Then whatever happened that morning doesn't change what I owe either of you. He folded the letter carefully. The man who wrote this deserved to be heard. The man in front of me deserves to decide who he becomes. Warmth moved through my chest. I ignored it and went back to the ledgers. By noon, Gideon had unpacked the official wax seal impressions he'd taken before leaving the palace archive. We laid them beside the marks on the forged transfer orders. At a glance, they looked identical, but the copied seal carried a tiny flaw near the wolf's left ear. The same flaw showed up on every single document authorizing missing supplies. A duplicate, Gideon said. Cast from a mold. Theo found the next thread while sorting shipping receipts. The names lined up exactly with the 6 shipping firms from Kieran's list. In the black notebook, the same 6, plus one more that hadn't been on it. 7 companies in total, 7 different addresses on paper, but every payment ran through the same private bank account, controlled by Edmund Castellan's personal secretary. Kieran had found 6 of the 7 threads on his own, working alone, months before any of us thought to look. It had simply taken someone else, cross-referencing his notes against fresh receipts, to find the last one. When the snow finally eased on the 3rd morning, Damien sent coded orders to investigators already working in the capital. Over the following 2 days, couriers came back along the cleared eastern road with reports that laid the whole pattern bare. Edmund had planted loyal clerks in the treasury, the mailroom, and the northern warehouses, cutting Damien off from any inconvenient truth and pinning the shortages squarely on me. He'd already chosen my replacement before the divorce petition was even filed, I said, pointing to a letter recommending Elias Castellan as the next royal consort. Elias was Edmund's 24-year-old Omega nephew, known at court for his quiet manners and his total dependence on his uncle. Damien's expression went flat and cold. A consort under Edmund's control would give him access to every private council session and every household appointment. And eventually, every decision you make. Damien looked across the table at the duplicate seal, the intercepted letters. The entire future, Edmund had quietly built around him. He didn't just steal from the crown, he said. How is building a second throne behind mine? I thought of Elias's tense, apologetic posture the one time I'd seen him at court, years before any of this began, and felt something closer to pity than triumph. He picked well. If all he wanted was someone easy to control, Elias never struck me as ambitious, just frightened. Frightened people make convenient consorts. Damien said quietly. "They don't ask questions loudly enough for anyone to hear." "They ask them anyway," I said. "Just not where anyone's listening." Kieran did. "I imagine Elias has too, in whatever rooms his uncle doesn't walk into." Damien looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You keep defending people who could just as easily be working against you." "I keep noticing that most of the people working against me were never given a real choice in the matter," I said. "Edmund is a different problem entirely. He chose this, repeatedly, on purpose. That's the difference that matters to me." A knock interrupted us. A royal courier handed Damien a sealed message from the capital. Edmund had discovered the letters were missing, called an emergency council session, and publicly accused me of forging evidence at Thorn Hollow. Damien finished reading, then handed the message to me instead of deciding on his own what I needed to know. "He wants a scandal loud enough to condemn you, even if he can't manage chains," he said. I folded the paper and set it beside the black notebook. "Then we go back before he finishes writing the ending for us. If the council's already decided I'm guilty," I added, "I'd rather hear the lie said to my face." 2 days later, Royal Engineers cleared the southern road. By sunrise, Damien and I rode toward the capital with Gideon, Theo, and 4 sealed cases of evidence. Thornhollow disappeared behind us under a pale winter sky. I'd wanted Theo to stay behind, safe. "They used my name in the warehouse records," he said, refusing. "If I stay quiet, the Chancellor will say I never existed." Damien assigned 2 guards to protect him and promised Theo would only speak if he chose to. Rumors beat us home. Edmund had already claimed I'd forged the notebook, manipulated northern families, and used Damien's absence to invent an entire conspiracy from thin air. "His sudden change in temperament," he reportedly told the council, "only proves he's unstable." It was, I had to admit, an almost impressive accusation. Apparently cheerfully accepting a divorce was more suspicious than embezzling thousands of crowns. When our carriage rolled into the palace courtyard, no servants came out to greet me. Council officials watched from the steps in silence, under the marble archway. Edmund looked less like a frightened man caught in a lie, and more like a patient teacher waiting for a slow student to fail on schedule. Beside him stood Elias Slender, pale, so tense his hands trembled at his sides. "Your Majesty," Edmund said, bowing to Damien with theatrical relief. "Thank the stars you've returned safely. I feared Lord Ashford had cut you off from sound judgment entirely." Damien's face gave away nothing. "The council will hear every claim tomorrow." Edmund turned his smile on me. "Of course, truth should never fear examination." He said it lightly enough that half the courtyard probably heard it as simple courtesy. I heard it for what it actually was, a warning dressed up in good manners. The exact kind of sentence the original Kieran had spent years learning to translate too late. I filed it away next to everything else I intended to make him answer for, right alongside the memory of Edmund smiling at me across that courtyard, as if bowing to a fiction he'd built himself was the same thing as bowing to the truth. That evening, Gideon discovered our archive access had been quietly suspended. The Treasury had refused to release the original ledgers, and 2 warehouse witnesses had abruptly withdrawn their statements. Someone slid a note under Theo's door threatening his sister's apprenticeship if he testified. Elias got a different kind of threat. Edmund promised to expose his mother's debts and evict her from the family estate unless Elias accused me of pressuring him to take my place as royal consort. Gideon, for his part, found his own reputation quietly under attack. A rumor began circulating among the junior archivists that he had falsified the wax seal comparisons himself, out of some personal grudge against the Chancellor's office. It was such a specific, well-timed lie that it could only have come from someone inside the palace who knew exactly which weakness to press. Gideon took the accusation with more grace than I would have managed, simply requesting in writing that anyone repeating the claim put their name to it first. No one did. "They're testing which threads to pull," Damien said, when I told him about it, "trying to see which of us breaks first and gives them a reason to delay the hearing entirely." "Then we don't break," I said. "We wait them out, and we keep every single thread they touch." It was easier said than lived. That week, someone left a dead songbird on the windowsill of the room I'd been given. No note attached, no message needed. I didn't tell Damien. I told Gideon instead, quietly, and he simply added it to the growing list of things Edmund's people would eventually have to explain in front of the council, filed under a heading he'd started calling, with grim humor, "Incidental Cowardice." It wasn't much comfort in the moment, but it meant the list kept growing. And lists, unlike fear, have a way of eventually demanding to be read aloud. I found Elias alone in the conservatory after midnight, watching frost creep across the glass. "I never asked for your position," he said quietly. "My uncle told me obeying him was the only way to protect my mother." "Then tell the council that—" He shook his head. "You don't understand what he controls." "I understand more than you think." I showed him, but didn't hand over a payment record linking Edmund's secretary to the false shipping companies. "You're not responsible for the cage he built around you, but you get to decide whether you help him lock other people inside it too." He was quiet for a long time, arms wrapped around himself against the cold. "Do you know what it's like," he said finally, "to spend your whole life being told you're lucky to have an uncle who took you in, lucky to be considered for the palace at all, lucky that someone bothered to want you, when everyone else in the family had already decided you were too quiet, too nervous, too much trouble to keep around." He laughed, a small, brittle sound. I used to believe him. I think some part of me still does, most days. "Luck," I said, "is a word powerful people use on people they'd rather not have to justify controlling." Elias looked at me properly for the first time since I'd found him there. "You sound like you've had that said to you too." "Once or twice," I admitted. "The trick is realizing it's a leash dressed up as a gift, and then deciding you're allowed to take it off." He didn't answer right away, but when I left the conservatory that night, he was still standing at the window, and for the first time, his shoulders weren't quite as hunched as they'd been when I found him. Before dawn, Damien met us in a guarded records room. "If I move against Edmund too early," he said, "his allies deny everything and vanish behind him before we can prove a thing." "So your plan is to let him accuse me publicly," I said, "only until every official backing him is on record." I held his gaze. "The moment Theo is threatened, someone tries to detain me, or you lose control of that room, this ends immediately." Gideon would stay at my side, and I'd keep copies of every document myself. Damien agreed without a single argument. By the time the council bells rang, the chamber was packed to the doors. Nobles who'd never once bothered to learn my name during 4 years of marriage now leaned forward in their seats, hungry for the spectacle. Edmund presented forged transfer orders bearing my seal and called me, without a trace of irony, a danger to the crown. He leaned hard on an old prejudice that an abandoned Omega was emotional, unstable, and therefore easy prey for anyone with a convincing story. I also knew that silence had been the exact weapon used against the original Kieran for years, and hearing it turned on me again felt uncomfortably like history, deciding to repeat itself out of spite. When the council recessed, I cornered Damien in the private corridor. "How long do you intend to let them bury me under this?" "Until Edmund believes he's shown me the loyalty of everyone standing behind him." "And what happens to me while you wait?" He stepped closer. "I need you to trust me." I laughed once, with no humor in it at all. That's a strange thing to ask from the man who never trusted the last version of me. His expression cracked, just slightly, but I kept going before I lost my nerve. "I'm finishing this because Thorn Hollow deserves justice. Theo deserves safety. The man who lived this life before me deserves to have his name back. But when this hearing ends, win or lose, I'm leaving this palace for good." The council bell rang again. I turned and walked back into the chamber, where Edmund Castellan was already smiling like a man who'd written the final page of the story himself. "Before this council accepts one more document bearing my seal," I announced, standing in the center of the chamber with the forged transfer order spread across the long oak table. "I have a simple question. When exactly was Violet Black ink introduced to the royal offices?" Edmund's confident smile faltered by half a degree. Nobles leaned forward, plainly hoping to watch me fall apart in real time. I tapped the date beside my supposed signature. "This order claims I approved a transfer 7 months ago, but Violet Black ink was only introduced to the royal offices 4 months ago. Chancellor Castellan approved that purchase himself." A murmur rippled through the room. One of the older council members, a beta named Lord Whitfield, who had said nothing in my defense until that exact moment, leaned toward his neighbor and murmured that he'd personally approved the ink requisition 4 months prior and would swear to the date under oath if asked. Edmund's eyes flicked toward him, and for the first time all morning, something like real alarm crossed his face before he smoothed it back into practiced calm. "A minor clerical oversight proves nothing," he said, recovering quickly. "Then let's examine the seal." Gideon stepped forward with 2 impressions mounted under clear glass, One came from my official seal, which had never left the locked royal archive. The other came from Edmund's own transfer orders. The copied mark has a flaw beside the wolf's left ear, Gideon explained. That same flaw appears on every falsified document in this case. Investigators had already traced the lease on a private workshop back to Edmund's personal account. A sealed search had turned up wax, carving tools, and the duplicate mold itself. Edmund rounded on Damien. "Your Majesty, this is manufactured evidence." Damien said nothing, but this time I understood the silence for what it actually was. Not abandonment. Room. Space for Edmund to keep talking until he'd finished exposing himself completely. I set the black notebook on the table and opened it to the list of shipping companies. 7 companies were paid for supplies that never once arrived. Every payment routed through a single private account controlled by the Chancellor's own secretary. Edmund lost all the color in his face. 3 Treasury clerks along the wall lowered their eyes and suddenly found the floor very interesting. Damien finally spoke. "Stand." The command was quiet, but every clerk rose regardless. Damien named the accounts they'd opened, the documents they'd falsified, the payments they'd pocketed. Investigators had spent 3 days tracing every coin. The final confirmations had arrived just that morning. Edmund had expected the council to shield him. Instead, he'd gathered every last accomplice into one convenient room. "Theo Marsh," Damien said, his voice gentler now. "You may speak, if you choose to." Theo stepped forward with trembling hands and laid the threatening note about his sister's apprenticeship on the table. He described the relief wagons that had passed Thorn Hollow empty, while official records swore they'd been delivered full. Edmund called him an ungrateful servant. That was the moment Elias stepped away from his uncle. "No," he said, voice shaking but clear. "He's telling the truth." Edmund stared at him like the floor had opened beneath his feet. Elias set his own written statement beside Theo's the threats against his mother, the plan to install him as consort, Edmund's private promise that Damien would soon rule in name only. Shocked whispers filled the chamber. Damien rose from the throne. "Edmund Castellan, you are removed from office, effective immediately. Your accounts and estates will be frozen pending public trial. You, and every official who assisted you, will face prosecution under the full law." Edmund protested. No one answered him. Whatever authority he'd been borrowing evaporated the moment the truth stood up in the room with him. Damien stepped down from the platform and stood beside me in front of the entire council. "Kieran Ashford was falsely accused," he announced. "His warnings were intercepted. His name was used without his permission. His reputation was damaged because this court failed, repeatedly, to investigate what he brought to it. The fault for that doesn't belong only to Edmund Castellan." He paused. "It belongs to me." He lifted the crown from his own head and set it on the table. Then the Alpha King lowered himself to one knee. Every voice in the chamber went silent. "I can't undo the years I refused to see you clearly," he said. "I can't ask the man who came before you to forgive what he suffered, and I won't demand forgiveness from the man standing here now. I can only tell the truth publicly, the way I should have from the very beginning. You were innocent. You were braver than anyone gave you credit for, and I failed you." I looked at the crown sitting next to the forged papers and understood exactly what that gesture had cost him. Damien wasn't asking me to come back. He was handing over the name his own silence had helped take from someone. I turned to Theo, Elias, Gideon, and the council members who could no longer avoid meeting my eyes. "Then let the record show," I said. "That Thorn Hollow was never a nest of thieves. It was a home built by people this kingdom had already decided to forget." Damien rose slowly. "And it will never be forgotten again." Behind me, I heard Theo let out a breath he'd apparently been holding since the hearing began. Gideon, ever composed, was already gathering the sealed evidence cases with the brisk efficiency of a man determined not to cry in a council chamber, and mostly succeeding. Elias stood a little apart from where his uncle had once kept him tethered, looking for the first time since I'd met him, like a person deciding what to do with all the space that had just opened up around him. Lord Whitfield, who had spent 4 years in that chamber saying nothing whenever my name came up, rose from his seat and bowed to me, not the shallow, obligatory bow reserved for a disgraced consort being escorted out, but the full, formal bow owed to someone the court had genuinely wronged. One by one, a handful of others followed his lead. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was the closest that room had ever come to admitting it had been wrong about something. And I found I didn't need more than that to feel, for the first time in this strange borrowed life, entirely and permanently unafraid. Damien didn't move from where he stood beside me until the chamber had mostly emptied. When it was just the two of us, Gideon and the guards by the door, he finally spoke, quietly enough that it felt like it wasn't meant for the record. "I keep thinking about the letters," he said. "How close they came to sitting in that cabinet forever. If Gideon hadn't gone looking, if you hadn't found the notebook in a suitcase seam, none of this happens. Edmund keeps his office. Elias becomes a hostage with a crown, and somewhere in a drawer, 3 letters stay unopened until they rot." "But we did find them," I said. "That's the part I can't stop turning over," he said. "How much of what I call justice today was actually just luck? A rut in the road, a suitcase that happened to be too heavy?" I considered that for a moment, because it deserved consideration rather than reassurance. "Luck got the notebook into my hands," I agreed. "It didn't write a single word in it. Kieran did that on his own, with no reason to believe anyone would ever read it. I'd rather build whatever comes next on the parts that weren't luck." Damien looked at me like that answer had cost him something to hear. In the good way, the way true things sometimes do. "Agreed," he said, and for once didn't try to make it sound like an order. The palace spent the days after the hearing in a kind of stunned, careful quiet. The way a house sounds after a storm has finally passed through it, everyone stepping gingerly around the wreckage, unsure yet what still stood and what had gone down with it. Nobles who had nodded along with Edmund's accusations a week earlier now went out of their way to bow to me in the corridors, which I found almost funnier than insulting. Lord Whitfield, of all people, sent a formal letter of apology so long and so thoroughly footnoted that Gideon joked he'd clearly written it, hoping it would double as testimony at his own eventual retirement hearing. I kept the in the end, not because I forgave the years of silence it was meant to answer for, but because it was proof, in his own careful handwriting, that the record could still be corrected when enough people finally decided the truth was worth the paperwork. I tucked it into the same drawer where I kept the original Kieran's unsent letters, so that one day, if anyone ever doubted how much had changed, there would be evidence sitting right beside evidence of how long it had taken to get there. The divorce became final 3 days after the hearing. Damien signed first, then set the document in front of me without argument, condition, or a single request attached. "Your freedom shouldn't depend on whether I deserve a second chance," he said. I signed beneath his name, and for the first time, the end of our marriage didn't feel like rejection. It felt like a door I'd chosen to walk through on my own terms. The investigation ran for months. Edmund Castellan was convicted of fraud, abuse of office, witness intimidation, and conspiracy against the crown. His properties were sold, and every recovered coin went straight into the Northern Relief Fund. The clerks who'd helped him lost their positions, repaid what they'd taken, and were barred from public office for life. Cooperation only softened their sentences, never erased them. Elias testified in full, then moved with his mother to a modest home near the coast, where he began training as a teacher. Theo's sister kept her apprenticeship, and Theo himself earned a scholarship to the Royal Academy where he chose accounting, on the theory that numbers were far easier to trust when honest people were the ones guarding them. Thornhollow received permanent legal protection and became the founding home of a new relief foundation. My name was cleared, but Damien went further than that, telling the full court that Kieran Ashford had uncovered the theft months earlier and been ignored, because powerful men had found his silence convenient. The original Kieran finally got the recognition he'd spent years begging for. I went back to Thornhollow with no royal title at all and discovered that freedom came with leaking roofs, endless supply lists, and children who apparently believed my office belonged to them the second breakfast ended. It was, without question, the happiest work I'd ever done in either of my lives. Damien never once asked me to return to the palace. Instead, twice a month, he left the capital Friday afternoon and stayed at Thornhollow until Sunday morning, arriving with no royal procession at all, just a horse and a very poorly disguised amount of hope. At first, he brought expensive gifts. I sent every one of them back. On his next visit, he brought lumber instead and spent 6 hours repairing the garden fence with Theo. His measurements were genuinely terrible. His effort was not. Over the following year, he learned I take my tea without sugar, hate formal dinners with a passion, and need quiet before making hard decisions. More importantly, he learned to ask before entering my room, before changing my plans, before offering help I hadn't requested. I learned that Damien loves old mystery novels, cannot bake bread to save his life, and laughs most easily when no one in the room is treating him like a king. Trust came back slowly, not as a command, and not as some grand romantic gesture, but as 100 small, ordinary choices, stacked one on top of another until they held weight. On the first warm evening of spring, Damien met me in Thorn Hollow's garden under the pear tree Ivy had planted the previous fall. He was holding a simple wooden ring, carved by hand, slightly uneven. "I'm not asking you to become royal consort again," he said. "I'm asking whether I might become your partner wherever you decide to live. For however long you'll have me." I looked toward the house, where Theo was reading aloud to the younger children beside an open window, smoke curling from freshly repaired chimneys, flowers lining the path, every room glowing with something that finally felt safe. "Yes," I said, "but we're keeping separate offices." Damien smiled. "That's entirely reasonable. We married again in that garden, with Gideon, Elias, Theo, and every Thorn Hollow family standing as witnesses." Mrs. Pratchett cried through the entire ceremony and denied it loudly to anyone who mentioned it afterward. Nell, 12 by then and taller than she had any right to be, stood at the front holding a ring cushion she'd sewn herself out of an old flour sack, visibly furious that no one had asked her to say a few words, until Damien handed her the floor anyway, and she delivered what remains, to this day, the longest and most heartfelt toast either of us has ever received from someone who still occasionally needed help reaching the top pantry shelf. There were no political contracts, no jeweled crown, only promises we'd written ourselves, on a single sheet of paper that Gideon later insisted on having properly bound, for the historical record, though I suspect he simply liked having an excuse to visit. Years later, the old divorce papers ended up behind a family photograph in a plain wooden frame. In the picture, Damien and I stand on Thorn Hollow's porch, surrounded by the people who turned a ruined estate into a home no one could ever forget again. One quiet morning, I found him in the sunlit kitchen making coffee while children laughed outside among the pear blossoms, Ivy's youngest cousin now chasing Nell's dog across the grass. A whole new generation of Thorn Hollow already forgetting there had ever been a time when the chimneys stood cold. Theo had gone that spring to take up his first post at the Academy's accounting office, and wrote every week, always ending his letters the same way: "Tell Mrs. Pratchett the numbers still behave." Elias visited twice a year with his mother, who had taken, somewhat surprisingly, to gardening, and who fought Mrs. Pratchett every visit over whose roses were doing better. He'd stopped apologizing for taking up space somewhere along the way. I noticed it first the year he arrived and simply announced, without prompting, that he intended to stay a full week instead of his usual 3 days, and dared anyone to have an opinion about it. Nobody did. Gideon eventually retired from the Royal Archive altogether and took up residence in Thorn Hollow's old library, cataloging every letter, ledger, and account book from the investigation for posterity. Though we all understood by then that posterity was simply the word he used for a home he'd quietly decided he preferred to the palace, he still corrected Damien's grammar in official correspondence, out of habit, and Damien still let him, out of something that had stopped being habit years earlier and had become, unmistakably, affection. My 3 old suitcases sat up in the attic, empty and gathering dust. I no longer kept them packed by the door, the way the original Kieran once had, ready at a moment's notice to run from whatever came next. I was no longer waiting to escape fear, or loneliness, or injustice. I had already outrun all 3, one ledger, one letter, and one very stubborn refusal at a time. I'd been handed another life, entirely a second chance folded inside a stranger's story, and at last, after all of it, I'd chosen exactly where it belonged. Not in a palace, not in a crown, here, in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke, beside a man who had finally learned that love wasn't a performance for other people to judge, but 100 small Fridays, arriving without a procession, asking permission at the door. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I still take the black notebook down from its shelf, not because I need it anymore, but because it reminds me how a single stubborn, unheard voice managed to outlast the people who tried to bury it. I like to think the original Kieran would have liked knowing that. In the end, someone finally read every page. Occasionally, Damien asks whether I ever think about the life I left behind in Chicago: the apartment, the unwashed mug, the spreadsheet nobody ever finished. I tell him the truth less and less. and never with regret, though I sometimes still catch myself reaching for a coffee mug that no longer exists. In a kitchen that never once, in either of my lives, felt quite this much like mine, that life ended quietly, without ceremony, the way most lives probably do. This one began with a divorce. I signed gladly, in a room full of people who expected me to cry, and it turned into something neither the original Kieran nor the exhausted accountant I used to be could have written on their own. I don't know what to call the man standing in this kitchen most mornings, half asleep, arguing gently with a king about whose turn it is to feed the chickens, or whether the coffee needs one spoonful of sugar or none at all. I only know he chose to stay, and that I chose, every single ordinary morning and after, to let him. If this story pulled at something in you, tell us down in the comments which moment got you the most. We genuinely read through every one of them. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so the next story finds you the moment it drops. Thank you for spending this time with us. Truly.